Emma Wolukau-Wanambwa is an artist who actually lives and works in London. She has recently been shortlisted for a Film London Artist Moving Image Network Award. And when we met her for the first time, she proposed this idea of a dialogue for the marathon and met Stephanie Lawler. Stephanie was born in Liverpool, lives in Newcastle upon Tyne, where she is a reader in sociology at the Newcastle University. She's also the author of 2 books, Mothering the Self, as well as Identity, Sociological Perspectives. A very warm welcome to Emma Wolukau-Wanambwa and Dr. Stephanie Lawler.
Sorry about that, it's my very geriatric laptop, I think, that's causing the problems. But anyway, so we can agree that societies use cultural forms and cultural practices to attribute meaning to the external world. The external world being phenomena, other people, so in that sense kind of constitutive of social reality. And there's a moral and ethical dimension to this, in that any society or social formation will, through these forms and practices, produce and circulate values and beliefs that it wishes to maintain. And a crucial part of that for me, certainly, within the context of this conversation, are how, through cultural forms and practices, the socially determined limits of acceptable behaviour are established. That is, what one can say, do, and even think without risking punishment or expulsion. Cultural forms and practices being socially and historically constituted, they are, of course, subject to always to contestation and change. And all of this unfolds, of course, within the framework of a society's given power relations, which means that all the meanings, values, and behaviours that a society produces and promotes through its cultural forms and practices will almost always privilege some groups at the expense of others. The powerful have what I think you've described as world-making power. They are the ones whose judgments stick. What interests me is how cultural practices and cultural forms ingrain beliefs and values to the point where they become so internalized they often cease to be perceptible to the people whose lives they govern. If one is fortunate enough to live comfortably within the... if one is fortunate enough to live comfortably within the framework of a society's given social formation, these beliefs and values become invisible. They get under the skin. They come to be perceived as normal, and they seem to rest on a very powerful assumption of universality. That is, everyone is or should be like me. It's only in the moments and spaces of transgression, when the boundaries are crossed or complicated, that they become visible. I mean, as I said to you before, one recent example of that is one of the meanings of the proposed changes to child benefit, and the way in which one of the things that change will do is to seek to redefine what the normal or average family is. And I think it's a good example because it reflects how a normal or supposedly universal attitude, behaviour or lifestyle is produced and enforced by the most powerful social groups. How class continues to be a crucial structural force, certainly in this society. I mean, would you agree that there are now the most powerful social group now is the middle class? I mean, I'd say that they are, and that their processes of identity formation and their active assertion of social dominance is not generally visible or up for discussion because of the way in which their beliefs and values and behaviours have come to occupy the space which is called normal.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. And I think one of the things you're referring to here is what sociologists and anthropologists call unmarked categories. Categories that pass without particular definition.
It's like when Bourdieu says they come without saying because they go without saying.
Exactly, yeah. It's a position of tremendous privilege to occupy an unmarked category, to be in the realm of the normal. But it's a privilege that's denied. It's a form of denied or hidden power that Bourdieu talks about in terms of symbolic violence. Because it's invisible to both, this is the crucial thing, to both the dominated and the dominating. And this is because, I think it's because it comes to be natural. Privilege is so often invisibilized. It's certainly a social phenomenon, or a set of social phenomena, but they become magically turned into nature so that they're seen as if they were natural characteristics of the person. So I rule you because I'm better than you. And this is something about, obviously, I'm doing referred speech there, but this is something that is tremendously powerful, actually, and remains tremendously embedded in the fabric of the social.
And embedded in the way, in terms of not only how power is distributed, but how space is distributed. Maybe we were talking before about, historically, things like the development of class discourse around mapping of the city, for example. So Booth's poverty map of London, where it's not only about where people live, but it's about what kinds of characteristics that they might have. And so the body and the landscape become stigmatized. So, I mean,
and you get, I'm sorry,
no,
you get bodies seen as within particular landscapes. You can see, I don't know whether you can read this, but the lowest class here is described as vicious and semi-criminal. So this is not simply about poverty and bad housing, it's about being bad people. And this carries on. There are lots and lots of contemporary examples of people being horrified about spaces existing, middle-class observers being horrified about spaces existing, and really mapping the space onto the people and characterizing the people very powerfully as bad people in bad places.
That are outside of social norms, which is what Deborah Waugh is talking about in terms of drawing on Goffman's definitions of social stigma, and how that carries with the body and with the place. We've talked also in terms of this about how, say, even the word working class has itself come to be expunged, certainly within the kind of mainstream discourse. So one isn't even working class anymore. We have the term of underclass.
This is, and what you've shown there, Emma, is a quote from Charles Murray, famously popularized, if not coined, the term underclass. And again, this is another example of the way in which a whole load of very disparate people, very, very different kinds of people, are brought together through, this was one-way maps, conceptual maps work, through drawing borders. So we get single parents, long-term unemployed, people with disabilities, drug addicts. All of these people are then conceptually brought together in one group that then gets called the underclass, and they are stigmatized precisely in Goffman's terms. They are outside the normal. They're not normals.
And I mean, I showed this to you earlier today, but I was really interested by this quote by Lord Forsyth, who used to be David Cameron's tax advisor, because I like the way in which it does two things. Number one, the way it says the hard-working classes and those in the middle who generate the wealth. And I really like that because there's no labour qualification for being middle class. There's an assumption that you are productive and industrious. And the working class as a character disappears. And what we have is a qualification that one must be hard-working to be considered to be legitimate within the terms of this debate. So I really like the way it draws a boundary in terms of who counts and who doesn't count in terms of the priorities of a society.
Quite, but I think it works, there's a reverse movement as well, so that those then characterised as middle class are characterised as hard-working. And if they then conceptually own that term, then it has to be sort of stripped from everybody else, and they can therefore be seen as not hard-working. And we're back to notions of the deserving and the undeserving. Not only the deserving and the undeserving poor, but increasingly notions of the deserving and undeserving rich. And this is other ways that boundaries get brought through a kind of moral formation.
And I think that we just talking before also about this is where so much kind of humour, sort of class-based humour comes from. So, I mean, we have Keeping Up Appearances, which was on 90 to 95 on BBC, which was all about a woman who had come from a very working-class family that was depicted always as being quite squalid, happy and content and complacent, but quite squalid and disgusting. And she was trying to pass as a middle-class woman, and the humour was about how she was always constantly being tripped up or getting it wrong.
Yes.
And it's humour that's about border panic,
yes.
about whether one can leave one's roots behind, or is one authentically or inauthentically part of a different class group.
Yes, exactly. And the notion of authenticity is fantastically important, because what Hyacinth Bouquet is pretentious. So there's a gap between what she seems to be and what it's understood she really is, and this is back to the idea of nature.
Yeah, which is why, and nature being, we're going to just have to skate over Little Britain, very interestingly, and a disabled person who isn't really disabled, and that's the joke. We have also Vicky Pollard and her middle-class teacher, who is the poor man who has to deal with these underclass people. I wanted just to point out this website, chavtowns.co.uk, which is still on now, and this is a quote you sent me, which is from the website. It's just, I think if there's one thing that should be done for the world, it should be to send all Chavs to death camps. Thanks for reading. I don't know if that's Reading the place or reading that he's happy for. But the kind of psychic desire to expel people and genocide, really, who don't fit within a kind of idea of understanding of social norms. Just the last thing just to touch on briefly in connection with that is the way in which expulsion occurs, but there is this kind of psychic re-engagement or desire. I mean, Alan, they talk about in terms of some people's identities then can be taken on or rather than being stigmatized by them, like say pram face, or many women have prams, but only some women are described as having pram face. You can nonetheless do things like this. So this is Chav night at University College London, where the future leaders of the nation all dress up like Vicky Pollard, fake pregnancies, all manner of tasteless behaviour which one can wear for the evening and then take off again. And I think there's lots of different things that are at stake in that, which aren't just about taking the mickey out of people. And I wondered if you had any thoughts that you could share with us about what this kind of movement signifies or represents.
I think this is fantastically interesting. It's an appropriation of a stigmatized identity. And what that appropriation seems to me to be doing is to reinstate a middle class, non-stigmatized, normative identity, because this is put on and taken off, not in the hope of passing, not like this is not Hyacinth Bouquet. These people don't want to pass as whatever the local term is in London, Chav, as we would say. They want to ridicule the identity as a means, we might think, of really psychically dealing with any anxieties they may have about their own identities. I also find it fantastically interesting that these things are even doable in the context of a liberal tolerance and multiculturalism.
Yeah, well, they fit within the socially determined limits of acceptable behaviour, thought and speech. I mean, the other example we looked at earlier was from Timorous Beastie's 18th century toile wallpaper, Glasgow toile, where rather than pastoral, the wallpaper depicts drug addicts and prostitutes and the homeless. And so a pastoral landscape from the 18th century wallpaper is now then remade as a rundown, degenerate urban environment. And I think there's there's kind of lots of things to do with how we conceive of space and culture and society that come out of these patterns of appropriation. And yeah, this was the quote from the Tracy Potts essay about kitsch.
I think one thing that's very interesting about this, thinking about going back to the, both the wallpaper and the Chav night, that this is, I think she describes it as something like doing a cultural air guitar.
Subjects of value are not only able to make the most of what they have, perfecting a particular habitus that allows them to proceed through the social world as a fish in water. They can afford, through performances of calculating hedonism, to let their hair down occasionally and play a kind of cultural air guitar. And so I found It's really made me think again, reading you and your work on this area has made me really think again about a sense of assumptions, because you were writing before about how even ideas of goodness now are totally predicated on that position, but in a way that renders them totally invisible and kind of off the map.
Goodness and progress and morality and taste and the ability to appreciate aesthetics and what Pierre Bourdieu calls the right ways of being and doing have all got bound up together in a kind of constellation, so that to see bad taste is now to signify, say, reactionary politics. And perhaps we need to think about how we might go about sort of untangling those. And at this point, I think we have to stop and continue our conversation afterwards. Thank you, everybody.